Upon returning to Hogwarts, Draco was more determined than ever to keep an eye on Potter and Weasley. He tried not to dwell upon the fact that watching the two of them usually meant watching Hermione too. If there was even a chance that Potter was trying to drag Hermione into some harebrained scheme against Lord Voldemort, there was no way that Draco would just stand by and let that happen. But Potter was known for bending the rules and getting away with it. He had already probably snuck out after curfew several times, albeit once to duel him. Draco smirked to himself. Potter seemed hell-bent on getting expelled or dying trying. Hermione definitely did not need to get herself involved in that. By now the story of the Halloween troll and the parts the trio played in it had gotten around the school. With each retelling, the troll got bigger and nastier. In some recounts, he had grabbed Hermione and had been nearly about to eat her. In others, the troll had been going on a rabid rampage, breaking lavatory sinks and tearing doors off their hinges when Potter stunned him. Whatever had happened, it became clear to Draco from watching the three of them that they had bonded over the incident. Oh. And so it was that one morning in the Great Hall, he overheard bits and pieces of a discussion about a dragon. Surely not. A stealthy follow of the trio down to the gamekeeper Hagrid's hut revealed something unbelievable. The oaf actually had a dragon's egg. No sodding way. It was just like Potter to get wrapped up in illegal dragons, Draco thought bitterly. Over the next week, Draco kept tabs on the trio and also on Hagrid and the dragon egg. Draco went down to Hagrid's hut more times than he had intended, drawn by the presence of the egg. The fact that his name essentially translated to dragon meant that he always carried a fascination for them. At first, Hagrid had been wary of him, knowing who he was and how contentious his relationship with Potter was. But Draco was naturally curious, and eventually Hagrid warmed to him. Still, Draco was careful never to be seen by Potter or his crew. He didn't want anyone knowing of his interest in the oaf's dragon egg and how much time he spent there in the hut with the man. Oh. One morning over breakfast, he saw the three of them hunched over a note. He walked around to the other side of the Slytherin table so that he was only a few feet behind them and tried to listen. Hermione, how many times in our lives are we going to see a dragon hatching? Weasley's annoying voice piped up. It was hatching. Draco had been waiting for days, certain that the hour was close. When the three Gryffindors stood and walked out of the castle instead of going upstairs to classes, Draco waited only a minute before he followed. Oh. Draco had not noticed himself inching closer to the window of the hut until Hagrid spotted him. Hagrid had not recognized Draco because he couldn't see his full face, as the window was clouded with the steam of his breath. Potter and the Weasel's angry voices could be heard shouting from within, but Draco bolted back up to the school. A real, live dragon right here at Hogwarts. A thrill of excitement mixed with fear ran up his spine. What the hell was Hagrid thinking? Then again, Draco couldn't blame him. If given the chance, he himself would gladly have a dragon as a pet. Oh. The next week, he visited Norbert a handful of times, learning bits and pieces about dragons and even sharing a bit of his limited dragon knowledge with Hagrid. Hagrid talked as though Norbert would only be here for a short time, intimating that there were possible plans in place for him to move to a dragon sanctuary. Norbert is such a good boy, you know. He loves his stuffies and his little blankie. He's such sweet company. But I know that Hogwarts isn't the best place for him, Hagrid said sadly one day when Draco was visiting. Hagrid was quite torn up about the idea of losing the creature, and Draco entirely understood the man's reluctance to part with the beast. But he also knew that the creature had to go. Seriously, who could think it was a good idea to keep a dragon around hundreds of schoolchildren? Draco continued to keep a close watch on the trio, in addition to being concerned about their quest regarding the Philosopher's Stone. He now felt sure that they were involved in some way with relocating Norbert. Somehow, Potter was going to get Hermione wrapped up with this illegal dragon business, and Draco was going to do his best to keep her out of it. If he could get Potter and Weasley in trouble at the same time, well, 2 birds with 1 stone and all that rot. Oh. Draco. Earth to Malfoy. Theo called to him from across the table in the great hall. Once again, he had been caught staring at Hermione, Potter, and Weasley. "What's got you going spare? You look like someone pissed in your breakfast, mate." "What? No, I'm just still annoyed that Potter made his house Quidditch team, the absolute prat," he said quickly. It seemed as good an excuse as any. All of Slytherin House was still angry about the loss to Gryffindor, the unreal finish to the game, and how it all came about at the hands of a first year who nearly swallowed the snitch rather than catch it. "Ah, no matter, the season is still young. Sure you're not just jealous of Potter?" Theo asked with a wry smirk. Theo knew him better than almost anyone, as they practically grown up together, and Draco knew he had a hard time masking his emotions. It was definitely something he would need to work on more. "And why the fuck would I be jealous of Potter?" He scoffed rudely. Blaise cast him a sidelong look and said nothing, pouring a bit more sugar into his porridge. "Language, Malfoy," Theo teased. "There is no reason to be envious of a specky git with a scar on his face," Draco said vehemently. "Can we get to class already? I'm willing to bet you that Professor Binns has already started his lecture. Half the time he doesn't even wait for class time to begin before he starts talking." The three Slytherins gathered their things, and Draco schooled his eyes to not wander back to the Gryffindor table and Hermione. There truly was no reason to be jealous of Potter, he thought to himself. Sure, he was famous and had won his first ever Quidditch match at Hogwarts as a first year. And he was friends with the smartest and most interesting witch in their class. But that was no reason to be jealous. After all, Hermione was friends with the Weasel, and Draco certainly wasn't jealous of him. No, it wasn't jealousy. It was simply concern on his part that Potter was about to get Hermione in serious trouble, while he tried to get himself expelled. That was all he told himself. Oh, the Weasel had missed class. Potter and Hermione were whispering anxiously, which made Draco nervous. He stopped Dean Thomas after class to ask where Weasley had been. "Not sure," Dean had said, eyeing him warily. "I heard he's up in the infirmary, might have eaten something bad." How would Weasley even notice, seeing how fast he scarfs down his food? Draco thought snidely, but it gave him an idea of what was really happening. Earlier that morning before breakfast, Draco had gone down to see Norbert. The dragon had been scampering about lately in the back pumpkin patch, and had been fluttering his wings as though getting ready to attempt flying. Additionally, his large teeth and breathy fireballs had grown. Where once Hagrid's beard was only occasionally singed, now, patches of grass had turned black with fire as the young dragon had tried his lungs. Hagrid had been reticent to let him, and likely anyone else, get too close to the dragon's cage. "Norbert's been acting a bit dodgy lately, so it might be best if you just look at him through the bars, yeah. Wouldn't want him take a nip out, oh ye." Oh, Draco was willing to bet that that was exactly what had happened to the Weasel. He chuckled to himself. Who better to get a dragon bite than that ginger kid? Draco hurried to the infirmary, convincing Madame Pomfrey that he needed to borrow a book from Weasley. Weasley saw him coming and pulled a face. "What do you want, you wanker?" Bold language for a knob-end that let himself get bit by a dragon, Weasel. "I'll bet you didn't tell Madame Pomfrey what it was that tried to make you its dinner." He spoke in a low voice, so as not to be overheard by the infirmary matron. "Stuff it, Malfoy. Why are you here?" Weasley's freckled pink skin was getting pinker by the second. In truth, Draco wanted to find out what their plans were about Norbert and to make sure that Hermione wasn't involved. He couldn't put his finger on exactly why he wanted to keep her out of it, but he found that he preferred not to dwell on that. This was just about getting Potter and Weasley in trouble, he assured himself. "Relax, Weasley. I only wanted to borrow a book," Draco lied easily. Draco looked at the small stack of shabby second-hand books on the bedside table. He picked up the top one and began to thumb through it. It had nothing interesting, so he tossed it onto the bed and grabbed the second. "So, what does that stupid oaf plan to do with his dragon?" Draco whispered stealthily. "As though I would tell you. Why don't you take your Ponzi ass out of here, Malfoy?" seethed Weasley. In due time, Weasby, Draco admonished, flipping through the third book. Aha, he found something. This book had a short note tucked inside. and with a quick glance, Draco spotted the words Norwegian Ridgepack. Draco smiled to himself and pocketed the book, satisfied as he left Weasley in the infirmary. If Hermione couldn't keep herself out of trouble, he would do it for her. He'd catch Potter and Weasley in the act, and perhaps they'd even get expelled for it. Draco relished the thought of being the one to turn them inches. He went to dinner that night with vague daydreams of turning the 2 Gryffindor wizards in, earning a school commendation for spotting wrongdoing and miscreants. The 2 Gryffindors were expelled, and Hermione was suddenly free to make friends with other people. Oh. That night, Draco waited for Potter and Weasley, knowing that it would likely take both of them to carry the cage holding Norbert up to the highest tower. Certainly neither of them had the brains or maybe even the magical skill to think of levitating it. He was standing flat against the wall, his head poking out just barely from a tapestry depicting 6 mermaids dancing or perhaps fighting with tridents, when Professor McGonagall grabbed him by the ear and yanked him from his hiding spot. Detention. And 20 points from Slytherin. Wandering around in the middle of the night, how dare you, she began tugging him down the hall away from the tower staircase. You don't understand, Professor. Harry Potter's coming, he's got a dragon. In his panic at being caught out of bed after curfew, Draco began spilling everything he knew. What utter rubbish! How dare you tell such lies? Come on, I shall see Professor Snape about you, Malfoy. She had dragged him away, and with it went his hopes of catching Potter and the Weasel single-handedly, and his chance of possibly seeing Norbert one more time before the dragon left for good. Oh. Detention. Detention. Wait till Father hears about this, Draco thought glumly. And all because he was trying to keep an eye on her and catch a couple of wrongdoers. Now, he and Hermione and Potter, and for some reason Neville Longbottom, were headed into the Forbidden Forest with no one but Hagrid and his scared dog to protect them. Draco had some confidence in Hagrid's abilities in the forest, but they were to split up in search of an injured unicorn. Hagrid was going with Hermione and Potter. Weasley had been still stuck in the infirmary, and so Potter had indeed roped Hermione into helping him. Potter and Hermione had gotten caught after leaving Norbert at the top of the tallest tower. Longbottom had snuck out trying to warn them and had been caught and given detention as well. Draco nearly asked to go with Hagrid and Hermione, but thought better of it at the last moment. Despite his thin veneer of bravado, he was a little afraid, and didn't especially want a witch, especially this witch, seeing that nighttime was not the time to go wandering around the Forbidden Forest. Really, Draco imagined that daytime wasn't either. He wondered briefly why they couldn't have completed this detention during the daytime hours. Hadn't Dumbledore warned them against this very thing, going into the Forbidden Forest? He crept along with Neville and Fang. The dog seemed even more on edge than the 2 boys he was with. Fang's tail was singed and bandaged, likely from an encounter with Norbert. Draco thought Fang likely had had his fill of magical creatures for a while and would have been far happier being left back in Hagrid's hut lying on the rug in front of the hearth. Unseen creatures moved about them, unnerving Draco. What the ever-loving hell were they doing here? Surely this sort of activity could have been done in the light of day. Unicorns came out in the daytime, didn't they? Injuries to animals happened all the time. Couldn't this wait until daybreak? Draco's thoughts ran away nervously. Neville, what the fuck was that? Draco turned quickly as a large branch cracked to their left. He grabbed Neville's arm. Without even looking around, Neville raised his wand and sent up a stream of red sparks into the sky. What the hell did you do that for? Now Hagrid's going to think we're in danger. And Hermione is going to think that we were scared, he thought privately. He hadn't been, of course, he thought to himself. Oh. And so now he was stuck with Fang and the boy wonder while Neville went off in a different direction with Hagrid and Hermione. When they entered a clearing and saw that thing eating the dead unicorn, it felt like all he could do not to faint or vomit on the spot. He hadn't known what it was, hadn't known what he was seeing exactly, other than knowing that it was a horror beyond anything he'd seen before. The glowing creature, so beautiful and strong, slain on the forest floor, its magical blood spilling everywhere. The guttural noises of the beast. Mem. Being. Thing feasting upon it were like nothing he ever wanted to hear again. He raced back to where he had last seen Hagrid. Hot on the heels of the fearful boarhound who crashed headlong through the undergrowth heedless of path or person. Panting by the time he reached Hagrid and Hermione and Longbottom, Draco spat out the story of what they'd seen, the details that he could recall. He did not make eye contact with any of them. Aware of how it looked that he had left Potter with the evil creature that was currently eating a dead unicorn. Hagrid hurried off in the direction from which Draco had come, his large shoes beating down a path as he went. Neville looked nervously in the direction of the school and grabbed only Fang's collar. I'm just going to make sure Fang is secured inside Hagrid's cabin, Neville mumbled to the two of them. The frightened young wizard hurried up the trail to keep up with the nervous dog, who tugged at his collar frantically. Draco sank to the ground beneath a large oak tree, still panting slightly. Now that the danger had passed, he felt almost silly. When he felt the shadows shift over his head, he looked up to find Hermione standing over him, an uncertain look up on her face. Are you okay? You must have been scared, she asked in a quiet voice. She wrung her hands distractedly in front of her. She was concerned about him. This threw Draco for a loop. Perhaps it was only Potter she was worried about, though. That made far more sense. I'm fine, Granger, he offered with more ease than he felt. Still, the shivers that went up his spine as she eased herself to the ground to sit next to him below the tree were enough to set off a new look of worry from her. Fine, he repeated more forcefully. She lit her wand with a muttered lumos, and he was grateful for the warm light that it cast. She reached in the cuff of her jumper and withdrew a familiar white square. Here, I've been told that these come in handy sometimes. He could not miss the smile on her face that seeped into her voice. She held out the square to him. He did not immediately take the square of white cloth. Instead, rubbing his hands along the goose flesh on the backs of his arms underneath his jumper. To his extraordinary surprise, Hermione turned towards him and began mopping the sweat from his brow without his input. His breath seemed at once too much and little for his lungs. What was the meaning of this, then? He found himself breaking out in a fresh sweat at her touch. He raised his silver eyes to meet her copper ones, an unspoken question in them. Why was she being so kind to him? She stopped and lowered the handkerchief, offering it to him again. Would you like it back? It is yours after all. Her smile warmed him even more. No, I told you it's yours now. And yet, it has the initials DM on it, she replied with a wry grin, her warm eyes meeting his. Hang on, I think I can fix that. He was glad to have something that perhaps he might be good at to show off for her. Especially after his showing of cowardice in leaving behind her friend and running away from the dead unicorn and the creature out in the forest. He raised his wand with more confidence than he actually had, pointed it at the handkerchief, and said firmly, Consuo elementum. He moved his wand as neatly as he could in small detailed movements. The handkerchief glowed briefly and he handed it back to her. I know Con is with, what is suo? She asked. To sew or stitch, he offered. At the first sight of her covered giggle, he said, slightly miffed, what? When I was a child, I had fishing nets for gulping plimpies and miniature shrikes from our lake. The damn spines tore through so many nets, I had to become a dab hand at magical sewing. A reparo never really seemed to hold that well. You were a dab hand, were you? The effusive giggles seemed to come on stronger. Hermione looked down at the handkerchief. Now, just an inch or so away from the green initials DM sat another set of green initials, this time HG. She gasped. Oh Malfoy, you didn't have to do that. She seemed a bit bewildered. And how did you know my favorite color was green? It is. I just chose it because my initials are green. Of course, my house colors are also green so. He turned slightly pink at the praise. Of course, she laughed. This was the first time Draco had ever heard her truly laugh out loud up close, and he felt even warmer for being the cause of her amusement. It amazed him how her bright copper eyes seemed to sparkle even in the low light of the lumos from her wand. I like green too, but I think my favorite color is brown. Well, really more like gold. In his mind, he slapped his forehead in disgust. He could have bit his lip for how much he really did not intend to say that. She seemed slightly surprised. You should have been sorted into Hufflepuff. You take that back right now, Granger, he said in mock fury. She laughed again, slapping him lightly on his arm in her glee, sending a jolt up his arm. If Draco had had his wand in hand, he thought it surely would have sent sparks up into the night air. Hagrid and Potter finally made their way back to the clearing, and the group started back towards the castle. Draco walked alongside Hermione in comfortable companionship over their encounter in the forest. He silently congratulated himself for not saying his whole truth back in that clearing. It wasn't so much just brown or gold that he liked now. It was really more of a copper. Oh. Chapter 6. Charms and Battle Harms. The summer before Draco's second year at Hogwarts had started very badly and ended worse. And he couldn't help but feel it was about 90% Hermione Granger's fault. Maybe 100% her fault. Slytherin had lost the House Cup despite the fact that Gryffindor lost their final Quidditch match soundly. And were at the bottom of the rankings going into the leaving feast. Somehow Dumbledore thought whatever Potter, the Weasel, and Hermione had done at the end of the year justified a buttload of points, and in a particularly annoying twist of the proverbial knife, the Pratt Longbottom, a boy so jumpy that he sent sparks up for help at the mere mention of a noise, was given 10 sodding points, lifting the Gryffindors above Slytherin on the house leaderboard. As Draco had already practically assured his father via fluke call that Slytherin had won the House Cup, this was very hard to accept. There were wild rumors galore about whatever it was that the trio had done. Everything from Potter had destroyed an ancient Hogwarts dark artifact, to a story where they'd fought a room full of goblins riding dragons. There was some nonsense about Quirrell going crazy and getting killed in the event. No huge loss as far as Draco was concerned. That babbling buffoon couldn't seem to tell the difference between a Grindylow and a Griffon, and had been a rather useless defense against the dark arts teacher. Draco couldn't help but wonder if this supposed artifact had been the Philosopher's Stone, but he had no way of finding out. Hermione had not even realized that he'd overheard them discussing Nicholas Flamel in the first place, much less that it had been he who had offered her the book she'd needed to find out about Flamel's extensive work in that field. He could only hope that the supposed artifact had been the Philosopher's Stone, and that it was actually gone. Oh, he had been home precisely 6 days when everything went to hell. The grading report from Hogwarts has arrived, and with it came the wrath of his father, who was supremely angry about his grades. Though they'd been quite high, they'd been accompanied by his class ranking. A large red number 2 out of 44 was scrawled across the bottom of the grading report, signed by Professor Snape. Mercifully, Draco and Narcissa had been out when the grading report had arrived, so Lucius had had some time to compose himself. It had not been nearly enough time, however. In the hour or so that he had been alone at the house, Lucius had taken to Draco's suite, destroying the handful of sentimental toys he still had from his childhood. The toy broomstick, the hand-carved wooden dragon puzzle sculpture, which stood 3 ft high and came apart into dozens of intricate pieces, his stuffed hippogriff Carlton. There was a tiny pile of cinder in the bottom of the fireplace in his room. Draco could see one of the milky blue marbles that had been Carlton's eyes in the bottom of the grate. This hurt in particular, as Carlton had been his first stuffy, his only one really. Draco rushed to the closet, a small wave of relief settling over him as he spotted the wooden box stored below his outgrown summer robes at the very back of the space. His Muggle books were still there, surprisingly. He turned back to the room to survey more of the damage and try to figure out what was going on. The grading report was sitting on his nightstand. A chill came over Draco as he read the report. All of the grades were quite high. Every one of his professors had had good things to say about his performance in class. It wasn't that the grades weren't good enough. It was the number 2 at the bottom of the page. Draco knew the first and only thing that Lucius would ask: who beat you for number 1? He worried about what his father would do when he told him who he suspected that it was. Draco had suffered beatings in his young life. His mother did what she could to protect him from that. But she wasn't always there, and she wasn't always able to stop Lucius. And truth be told, Draco knew that occasionally she had incurred them as well. They didn't happen incredibly often, but what the beatings lacked in quantity was far made up for in quality. His lip had been split more than once by the hefty signet ring on Lucius's hand. One time when he was about 8, in a particular torrent of rage about a broken crystal vase that had belonged to Lucius's grandmother. Lucius had grabbed a red-hot poker that he just used to stoke the fire in his study fireplace. Swinging it deftly, he'd struck Draco on the upper back, shattering Draco's right wrist with it as the young boy had raised a hand to protect his face. In bright sunlight, Draco could still make out the faintly raised pink scar from the burn just on the bottom of his arm. But this beating, the one that was about to happen, this one would be bad. Not only for that red number 2, but because the person who had received a number 1 on their grading reports was a Muggle-born. Oh. The Cruciatus curse had many side effects, depending on the strength of the curse and the fury of the caster. Thankfully, Lucius's resolve was tempered by Narcissa's pleas for mercy, and the effects were not as bad as they could have been, even taking into account that it was the first time Draco had ever experienced that particular curse. Back in Draco's room after it was over, Pym dripped Dittany on his open wounds and rubbed arnica salve into his muscles where he was able to. There were too many bits of broken glass in his skin to apply it very well, unfortunately. Draco's nerves twitched painfully across his entire body. Pym was elderly and had cared for members of Narcissa's family for many years. The Black family members were no strangers to scathing words meant to cut deeply into the soul. But beatings were not so common. Pym had learned that Malfoy men, however, were likely to settle disagreements with wands, weapons, and fists. Draco could tell that this bothered Pym, but the elfin way was not to criticize a master. Draco lay in bed on his stomach, too many small cuts from the shards of Lucius's crystal highball glass littering his back to feel comfortable enough to lay on it. In a strange way, though, it was almost a comfort being forced to lie with his face buried in his pillows. This way, he knew Pym didn't have to witness his tears. Pym was too kind-hearted to withstand that. Oh. Properly chastised and punished for his failure, Draco resolved to do better with his second year at Hogwarts. He would defeat Hermione Granger, take down Harry Potter, and do all that he could to come out on top this year. He had told his father this many times over the summer after the punishment was over. The tears had long been dried, and there was an unspoken remorse that fell over the dinner table between the man and his son in the nights after the Cruciatus curse and crystal glass incident. Draco was sorry that he had let his father down, and in his own way he felt that Lucius might be sorry as well. But Lucius grew tired of the discussion of how Potter had cheated to make his way onto the Gryffindor Quidditch team, of how the Mudblood Granger had beguiled and cozied up to the teachers and had become the class favorite to earn the top grades she received. It did not matter if Draco believed what he was saying, so long as his father believed it, he thought. Draco, it matters not to me what this filthy little mudblood does in her classwork, nor if Potter cheated. You are welcome to get back at them in any way that you see fit. But their actions are not your shortcomings. Your actions are your shortcomings. Oh. Blaise and Theo had come to spend a couple of days during the summer with Draco at Malfoy Manor. Draco was privately glad that they had come to him, rather than him having to go to their houses. For as gloomy as the manor could be if Lucius was home, this week had been a welcome reprieve. Lucius had traveled to France and Spain on business and would be gone all week. Tiberius Knott could make one wish that even a beautiful day would pass faster. Blaise's stepfather Selwyn was a creepy, annoying old man. And as for Blaise's mother, her seeking, probing, beautiful eyes and extreme attractiveness made Draco feel incredibly uncomfortable for reasons he didn't understand in her presence. The 3 boys lounged on the banks of the lake just behind the gardens at the manor, eating fruit cake and sandwiches and drinking Tiffy's delicious elderflower juice. They played 2-on-1 Quidditch, taking turns as the keeper. They had a contentious ongoing chess tournament, in which all 3 boys had claimed to be the victor. Blaise had brought another Muggle contraption. He called it a laptop, and it seemed to have endless games of far superior quality than the Game Boy that he had kindly passed on to Draco at the end of their first school year. What are you looking forward to most this year, Drake? Theo asked languidly, staring up into the blue sky littered with fluffy white clouds. I'm trying out for the Quidditch team. I'm hoping to make it. I kind of like to try my hand at chaser, but father believes I am better suited to be seeker. Father is buying me a new broom when we go into Diagon Alley before school starts. But your silver rocket 4 is in pristine condition. Why do you need another one? Blaze asked in confusion. Father just thought it would be better, Draco answered lamely. In truth, Lucius felt like he needed every possible advantage to make the team. His father didn't believe that his skill alone would be enough. So how many girls do you plan to snog this year? Blaze smirked lazily. 8, Draco answered with unearned confidence and swagger. The real answer, of course, was none, although for some reason that gave Draco a moment of pause. Hermione Granger popped into his head. He shoved the thought aside. What a silly idea, he thought. I myself am going for an even dozen, said Theo magnanimously. I want every witch to have a chance to enjoy my talents and charms. You're such a fucking tosser, not, Draco said, throwing a bit of cantaloupe at his friend and hitting him on the side of the face. Takes one to know one, mate. Theo grabbed a handful of grapes and whipped them at Draco's face. Draco ducked, then grabbed the grapes from the ground and whipped them right back towards Theo. Theo was ready for him, and used his wand to wordlessly redirect them. His magical aim was not very good, however, and the grapes ended up smacking Blaze directly in the forehead. Well, if that's how this must be. I hope you arseholes are prepared for battle, Blaze said dryly, taking up a large plate of ripe berries. The three of them couldn't help but laugh about the afternoon's food fight that night and well into the next day. Long after Pym had come and admonished the three of them for making such a great mess and chivied them inside to clean up for dinner with Narcissa. It had taken them excessively long showers to get every bit of fruit juice and pulp off. Oh. As he and his father made their way through Diagon Alley to complete his school supply list, Draco trailed behind slowly. He had already been chastised in Bergen and Berks for begging and poking around too much. He had been admonished for his table manners at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, who cared if he had his elbows on the table while finishing an ice cream cone. Even the act of buying his new broomstick at Quality Quidditch Supplies was soured by his father's sneer. I suppose I should buy the entire team one of these fancy new brooms, yes. I'm not certain that they will allow you to be seeker without a little, shall we say, gif? Lucius cut his eyes at Draco, as if wanting to make certain that Draco understood his opinion of his son's Quidditch skills. He had never even asked if Draco wanted to be a seeker. Draco could not remember ever even flying with his father. As a matter of fact, Draco much preferred being a chaser when he played with friends, but because Lucius had been a seeker, and because Lucius knew that Harry Potter was a seeker, apparently there was no better position for him on the Slytherin Quidditch team. Now, he and Lucius were fighting their way into the entrance of Flourish and Blott's bookshop. Taken by surprise by the flurry of excitement contained within the expansive but poorly laid out shop, they quickly made their way left towards the reception desk, where presumably his school books would already be waiting. Once again, he wondered why they hadn't simply gotten the books delivered by owl post as they had done the year before. In this claustrophobic and labyrinthine shop, his father seemed to be distracted and anxious, which was entirely unlike the elder Malfoy wizard. But Draco knew better than to ask what it was that they were doing here. Textbooks procured, and a charm placed upon them to levitate the package behind them, they started to the door. Lucius was growing more and more on edge, his eyes darting around as if looking for something. Draco suppressed a sigh, turning to his left to try to discern what the excitement had been about further back in the shop. There had been a book signing with that Pratt Gilderoy Lockhart. Draco had seen a few of his books at the manor, ones his mother sometimes picked up for light reading. And Narcissa often read the magazine Witch Weekly. This bloke was on the cover quite often, peacocking and preening as though he were royalty. Draco rolled his eyes at all the witches falling all over themselves to get close. Then a voice called out above the crowd, and suddenly, speaking of a peacocking Pratt that people thought of as royalty, Potter was standing in the front of the crowd, shoved up next to Lockhart. The older man smiled even wider, which Draco wouldn't have thought possible, while Potter shifted uncomfortably, turning red and looking at the group he'd emerged from for help. Draco looked where Potter was staring. A ton of red heads must be the Weasleys, of course. Then his eyes fell upon a familiar head of bushy hair. In fact, it appeared that Hermione was accompanied by a taller and older version of herself, evidently her mother. Though where Hermione's hair crackled with the excitement and magic contained within the bookshop, the elder Granger's hair fell in soft, silken waves. Next to them stood a tall sandy-haired man, who appeared to be trying to look everywhere at once and whisper something excitedly in the woman's ear. Great, Draco thought. She'd brought both her muggle parents. He wondered how he could get himself and his father out of the shop without Lucius noticing them. To his surprise, Lucius had also turned in that direction, and even more surprising, seemed to be edging his way towards the crowd. What was he playing at? Draco fervently hoped that Lucius wasn't about to bring up grades and class rankings. He wasn't sure he could live down the embarrassment of being called out in front of Hermione. Not to mention, his nerves were still a bit frazzled after the beating he'd received over those grades. Primarily because of the witch across the room. By now they were nearly upon the group. Draco decided that it was best to focus Lucius's attention on Potter rather than the Grangers. Harry Potter was a rival he knew his father shared with him. Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter? Draco spat, knowing full well that the other wizard has likely felt nearly as uncomfortable there in the spotlight as he himself had felt upon seeing them. Potter gave him a death glare, but Draco's mission was accomplished. Lucius was almost entirely focused on the scar-faced young wizard. Famous Harry Potter. Can't even go into a bookshop without making the front page, Draco scoffed. To his great amusement, the smallest of the redheads rose to Potter's defense. Leave him alone, he didn't want all that. The girl was clearly a Weasley, and yet where her brothers looked like they'd been fried then pickled like potion ingredients, she looked like a graceful little bird with jewel-bright eyes that reminded him of Hermione's. Her magic likewise crackled in the air. Draco felt that if she'd been born into a different family, he'd have found her great company. Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend. Draco crowed delightedly. He couldn't help but take the piss out on Potter. No one in their year had had a real girlfriend yet, and the idea of having one still seemed a bit absurd to his 12-year-old brain. The girl flushed with embarrassment and looked as though she wanted to hex him. Draco thanked the gods that she likely didn't know much magic yet with as many children and as little money as the Weasleys had. He doubted the girl's education until now had included much magic. Possibly none, if her get of a brother Ron was the metric against which to judge. Draco thought snidely. And speaking of said git, the angry little weasel stomped up to join in the discussion. And to Draco's horror, he saw that he was joined by Hermione. Draco hadn't had much chance to interact with Hermione after that night in the forest. He'd hoped that the event would open up the chance for them to talk more often, even if it was just in class, but there'd been no such moment. Soon after that night, the first years had begun diligently revising for exams, Hermione the most diligent of all. Then the night of that artifact business had happened, and the entire school was focused on the trio. Draco couldn't find a discreet moment to talk with her alone before the school year had ended. Oh, it's you. Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, huh? The weasel sneered. Draco was confused. Why would he be surprised to find a classmate in a bookshop that sold their textbooks for school? He tried very hard not to roll his eyes in annoyance, however. He and Hermione had left each other on good footing. He didn't want to upset that tenuous balance. Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley. I suppose your parents will go hungry for a month to pay for all those. Draco spoke quietly so as not to attract the attention of any adult nearby. Lucius would probably flog him for sparring in public, and despite his father's disdain for the Weasley parents, Draco still didn't want an adult to reprimand him. Not to mention, Draco really didn't want the Grangers to think badly of him. He wasn't certain why it felt as though that mattered, but in the moment, it did. Weasley had no compunction about attracting negative attention, however, and the situation quickly went arse over tea kettle. The git dumped his books off on his sister, then made as if to rush Draco. But the cooler heads of Potter and Hermione grabbed him from behind to stop him. This caught the attention of Weasley's father, who came to chivvy the group along to the outside of the stuffy and crowded shop. The ruckus has also caught his own father's attention. Lucius, formerly anxious and on edge, appeared at Draco's side with his usual glib and snide air. Draco clenched his teeth, fearful of what was about to happen. And all of it would take place in front of these normal-looking muggle parents who had no clue of the feud about to erupt here. Merlin, why has she brought them here? Well, Arthur Weasley, Lucius said, more a statement of disdain than of greeting. Lucius, said Mr. Weasley, nodding grimly. Busy time at the ministry, I hear. All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime. Lucius's sneer grew larger as he looked down at the smallest Weasley, holding what must have been 30 books in her cauldron. Lucius reached down, and for a wild moment, Draco thought he might be offering to help ease the obvious burden of the book's weights. Instead, his father dug through the cauldron, extracting the oldest, most battered textbook that Draco had ever seen being sold in a store. Lucius flipped through the book, smirking with disgust at the dusty pages. Obviously not. Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it? Lucius sneered at the older, bespectacled Weasley. Draco chanced a sidelong look at the Grangers, now huddled with their daughter held close at the edge of the group. With the sheer number of people crammed into the small space of the shop, they had nowhere to go, and Draco felt unease bubbling in his stomach. We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy, Mr. Weasley spat out. Only a thin veneer of politeness covering his disgust. Clearly, said his father, and now Draco saw the blond man look at the Grangers properly with a barely disguised sneer of revulsion. This whole time, Draco had hoped that the Muggles had escaped his notice, but he should have known better. The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could sink no lower. Without warning, Mr. Weasley leaped towards his father, knocking Lucius into a bookshelf behind them. Draco stepped aside towards the Grangers to avoid being hit. He had the vague notion of blocking the books from hitting her as well, though he had no idea where that instinct had come from. Thankfully, there wasn't time for him to analyze that because his father and the ginger man were throwing punches and knocking each other into bookshelves. Pages were flying, children screaming, and Mrs. Weasley had waded into the fray to yell loudly at her husband for fighting. Now Hagrid had come into the space where there had barely been room for a normal-sized person. He locked eyes with Draco as if to say, "Why am I not surprised?" Then with the dexterity and strength of a father dealing with bratty tiny toddlers, he pulled the two men apart, yelling at them to break it up. Draco's eyes went to his father, knowing that his father would not appreciate being treated like a child, especially by someone he considered to be a mere servant. For a moment, Draco was worried. Lucius's hand was inside of his robe, as though reaching for his wand, and Draco flinched out of instinct. But instead of the thin, sleek elm and dragon heartstring wand, his father only held the book he had taken from the Weasley girl. He held it out to her, muttering parting insults to Mr. Weasley, and turning swiftly towards the door. Draco finally gathered the courage to look at Hermione, and was surprised to find not only anger there, but concern and a little bit of hurt. "I'm sorry for that," Draco said as quietly but as clearly as he could to Hermione and her parents, and rushed to follow his father out the door. "Oh." Lucius was striding quickly to the leaky cauldron to take the flue home. Draco assumed he would still be upset and angry about the encounter, but to his confusion, his father seemed almost happy. Lucius wore a self-satisfied smile for the rest of the evening, even as his mother fretted over the black eye that was developing on Lucius's visage. Even their brief conversation about the Grangers didn't dampen Lucius's mood. Was that girl there the mudblood of which you spoke, the one who cheated her way into the top spot of the class? His father asked with a sneer. Draco knew he had never said that Hermione had cheated, only that she had worked to impress and befriend the professors. But his father was in too good of a mood for Draco to spoil. "Yes, that's her. Granger is her name." Draco corrected himself quickly. "Well, I expect better results from you this year. You have been given every gift in life, Draco. Do not squander it and allow this mudblood to take what is rightfully yours. I expect the top spot from you this year." "Yes, father." There was nothing more to say. Lucius had spoken, it was up to Draco to act. As the night wore on and dinner was served, Lucius's eyebrows darkened from reddish-purple to black. Draco wondered why his father didn't just heal the black eye, as it looked to be fairly minor. A simple spell would make it disappear. When Draco asked him, however, he simply smiled and said a bit mysteriously, "A battle scar is hard-fought and hard-won." Oh. The Hogwarts express ride back to school that year was uneventful. He sat with Theo and Blaise, Vince and Greg hovering at the edge of their crowd. Draco and the two larger boys walked down the train cars looking in the windows trying to spot Potter and the Weasel in the cars, just to stir up a little fuss before the professors got involved and could dock house points, but he could not find them. It was very odd. Had word of their near fight reached Hogwarts? Were they expelled? Draco looked in one car and quickly looked away, reddening slightly. Hermione sat with the youngest Weasley girl and the Paddle twins, along with some other Gryffindor girl that Draco vaguely recognized. No Potter in sight. As he moved on down the train corridor, however, the door to the girls' compartment opened and Hermione stepped out, calling to him. "Malfoy, can I talk with you?" Draco gestured for Vince and Greg to keep going back to their compartment and turned back to Hermione. "What did you need, Granger?" He intended it to come out roughly, but it came out more as an offer. Merlin, he needed to gather his wits about him better before he spoke to this witch alone in future. I wanted to say, I don't blame you. About the thing in the bookshop that day, she blurted. You shouldn't have tried to rile up Harry and Ron, but I know the three of you get into it sometimes. But it was Mr. Weasley who threw the first punch. Frankly, I was a little surprised by that whole thing. Draco chuckled softly. Yeah, me too. Then again, he did raise that git so. Hermione shook her head with a knowing smirk. Ron really isn't a bad guy, you know. He's actually a great friend. Some kind of hot. Something boiled up inside of Draco and he felt his face flush. It was like anger, but what was there to be angry about? He wasn't angry at her, and Weasley wasn't even here, would likely never know that he and Hermione were having this conversation. So it made no sense. He tried to push away the feeling and cover it with snideness. Yeah, with friends like that, who needs enemies? Trying to start brawls in bookshops of all places, he scoffed. I agree. That's why I just wanted to tell you that I didn't blame you. Draco looked up into her copper eyes which had filtered into his dreams more times than not over the summer. Most of the time, the dreams had barely been there at the forefront of his mind once he woke, details forgotten almost instantly. But a couple of times, including this morning. The dream had been quite vivid enough that he could recall it in great detail, and had relished the physical sensation that accompanied it. His face flushed even hotter than before, recalling what had happened when he awoke this morning. Thanks, Granger. He turned back to his compartment as she murmured her goodbye, and his eyes widened considerably as he walked. Because as they parted, he was almost certain, though he could not be sure, that she had called him Draco and not Malfoy. Oh. The Wonder Twins were at breakfast the next morning, and it gave Draco much delight to witness the howler that Weasley's mother had sent about stealing a car and crashing it. He, along with the rest of the Slytherin table, guffawed heartily. Now that he was back at Hogwarts, Draco felt the tension that had hovered over him for most of the summer, worrying about his father's wrath, was gone. He started eating 3 full meals again, something that he had done sparsely in the summer, mainly subsisting upon lunch and a handful of snacks that Pym would sneak him on the days that his father was home. His father was almost always at breakfast and dinner when he wasn't traveling, so it was easier to feign sickness, or only take a small amount so that he might be done quickly. Draco had lost a bit of weight and knew he looked rather gaunt and drawn, but hopefully the delicious food at school would turn that around. He threw himself into his courses, intent on besting Hermione this year. He found himself watching her in classes again, telling himself that he was trying to find a weakness in her schoolwork that he could step into to garner the top spot. To his annoyance, there did not seem to be one. One evening, Draco chose a study table in the library near hers, waiting until she disappeared into the stacks to locate another reference tome. When she disappeared, he casually wandered to her table, looking down at the several inches of parchment filled with her neat, square handwriting. Her essays seemed to be really well organized and in depth. Draco did not even recognize some of the spells and runes referenced in some of them. What do you want, Malfoy? A stern voice piped up behind him. It was Hermione, and she sounded far more standoffish than he had expected. Then again, Potter had just departed, so perhaps she didn't want to appear too friendly in case he was still nearby. I just noticed that you misspelled conscientiousness here, Draco said, pointing at her essay. There's a T in the word. You're right. Thank you. She tapped her wand on the page and the word corrected itself. As she settled in her seat and began to unmap a red sugar quill, Draco caught a whiff of scent that seemed familiar, taking him back to his days in the garden of the manor. Not wanting to walk away from her, Draco pointed to another part of the page. What is this spell? I don't recognize it. Draco knew many spells from his study at home over the years, but he had not swallowed the books as apparently Hermione had. Oh, the protein charm. It's a really brilliant way to make things match your original object. Let's say you have a flower bed of rose bushes, and one is beautiful and healthy, but the rest look a little dead and tired. You can charm the sad-looking ones to look like the beautiful one. And if, say one day you're tired of pink roses, you can change the original bush to yellow, and they'll all turn yellow. Interesting. Do they need to be next to each other? Or can you pick the roses and give them to a friend, and when you change the color, do the roses that you picked also change? Yes, that's the interesting thing about the charm. It works across space. In fact, I was wondering if it would apply to parchment. My parents are not able to get messages to me easily unless I happen to send it out to them and they have it bring back their messages. Last year, my father had a small emergency surgery and my mother wasn't able to tell me at the time. If I could figure out a way to leave them a charmed bit of parchment and I have the copy, they could write a message. And I could read it immediately. Then I could owl them back. Or perhaps I could make 2 pieces of parchment, both with the charm, and we can send messages back and forth. Hermione seemed lost in thought with the possibilities, miming writing in the air with her sugar quill. Draco sat back in wonder. Here was this young witch, looking up far advanced charms and solving problems with them. Draco had never encountered someone like this. He wanted to say something interesting to keep the conversation going. Well, does it need to be 2 pieces of parchment for each of you? Can't you just make 1 parchment for each of you and you can write back and forth? But what if you write at the same time? And what if you are using the same part of the page? Will the writing just overlap? Hermione's eyes seemed to sparkle with the prospect of new challenges to overcome. Maybe you can make the words vanish after they are read. Or you have 1 section of the page for you to write, and 1 section for your parents. That's interesting. I like that, Hermione said, fingers tapping out a staccato beat on the tabletop. The next question is, how do you alert the other person that you have written? How will they know to look at the parchment? Draco pondered, now also lost in thought. Maybe it glows, or it hoots like an owl, she suggested, and they both laughed, picturing a hooting piece of parchment. I'm not so sure about that, Granger, he said easily. Yes, perhaps not. But thank you for the ideas, Malfoy. I don't usually have. Her voice trailed away here, and Draco realized that her usual study companions probably did not offer much back and forth discussion like this. No problem, Granger, he said with a small smile, pushing his chair back to stand. As he walked away, Draco felt a bit sorry for Hermione. He was able to use the fireplace in the Slytherin common room to flue call his mother anytime. Presumably the same applied to the Gryffindor common room, but as Muggles, the Grangers would not have access to a flue. Because she's a mudblood, a voice whispered as though from the depths of his mind. It sounded a lot like Lucius's voice. He shook his head as though to clear his mind of the words. He supposed she was technically a mudblood, even if he thought the words sounded grossly inaccurate. But it didn't really seem to matter. This witch was kicking his and everyone else's arses in every subject they were taking. And she was making it look easy, he thought ruefully. He sat back down in his chair at his own study table, then looked up to find her watching him. Her copper eyes sparkled as they met his silver ones, and she blushed prettily, licking her lips and popping the red sugar quill between them. Draco flushed as well and looked back down at his own essay. He had enjoyed that whole interaction a lot more than he would ever admit. Oh. Chapter 7. Quidditch Woes, Slytherin's Foes, and More Questions Than You Can Swing a Dead Cat At. Like many of his interactions involving his 2 least favorite Gryffindors, Potter and the Weasel, Draco began it feeling on top of the world, and ended it feeling miserable. This was particularly true if Hermione was also involved in the interaction. His first Slytherin team Quidditch practice had been no different. They had taken to the pitch just after breakfast on Saturday morning, Nimbus 21s in hand. Marcus Flint, the Slytherin captain, had been awestruck when the trunk containing the brooms had been delivered the day before. Draco had already been named the new seeker for the team, and he hoped that it was entirely on his own merits. But he also knew that Lucius had written to Flint in the first week of school explaining that as an alum and former Slytherin seeker, Lucius would be honored if Flint would accept the gift of new brooms for the team, and so on. They were the envy of everyone watching, and Draco was bursting with pride, knowing that he was responsible for the spectacle they were putting on. Never mind that his father had bought the brooms, likely intending them as a bribe. It was he who had fought for and won the Seeker's Kit, his name stitched above the number 07 on the back of the green and silver jersey. No matter what else was said or thought, he had earned this. Shoving aside the Gryffindors from their practice was the icing on the cake. Oliver Wood, the Gryffindor captain, was practically apoplectic with rage. The Weasley twins were highly annoyed, and Potter looked outraged as well. Draco was beside himself in glee. Then Hermione and the Weasel joined the two teams as they squared off at the center of the pitch, and things went downhill quickly. As they often seemed to nowadays when Draco was around her and her two Gryffindor mates together. What's happening? Why aren't you playing? And what's he doing here? Weasley demanded of the Gryffindors, glaring in Draco's direction. I'm the new Slytherin Seeker, Weasley. Everyone's just been admiring the brooms my father's bought our team. Despite knowing how that sounded, Draco couldn't help but flaunting his family's wealth, and the Weasel's annoying freckled face would never get old. Especially after the incident this summer in the bookshop. He now knew for himself that what his father had always said before was true. The Weasleys really did have too many children and too little money. Hermione's eyes narrowed at him, but he had an audience now. Good, aren't they? But perhaps the Gryffindor team will be able to raise some gold and get new brooms too. You could raffle off those clean sweep 5s. I expect a museum would bid for them. Draco laughed. The twin Weasleys grew incensed, but their defense came not from someone on the team, but from the last person he'd hoped would offer it. At least no one on the Gryffindor team had to buy their way inches they got in on pure talent, Hermione said acidly. His gaze turned quickly to hers, silver meeting copper. How could she? Draco had worked hard to earn this spot. It was his father's taunting all over again. Did no one believe in him and his abilities? Draco's teammates roared with laughter and exchanged knowing looks. The self-loathing and uncertainty that he usually associated with interactions with his father roared back, flooding into his mind. No one asked your opinion, you filthy little mudblood, he spat out. The words tumbling out past his lips faster than his logical brain could filter them. He snapped his mouth shut, but it was already out there. It was the first time he had ever said that word. He had lashed out, wanting to make her hurt as much as he did. In an instant, he knew he had made a very bad mistake. She inhaled sharply, a look of confusion and hurt on her face. The disappointment in her eyes far outstretched the outrage and shouts of the other Gryffindors. And Draco nearly apologized to her right then and there. Then the Weasel's spell-taped wand was pointing at him, whatever spell he'd intended rebounding and hitting the Weasel instead. Weasley fell onto the soft grassy mud of the Quidditch pitch, clutching his cheeks as slimy green slugs began pelting the ground from his mouth. Draco and the rest of the Slytherin Quidditch team could do nothing but laugh and point as the slimy creatures poured from the Prat's mouth. That was, until Hermione dropped to Weasley's side and reached into the cuff of her jumper, withdrawing a familiar square of white fabric. She dabbed at Ron's mouth as he panted between waves of slugs, trying to wipe off most of the slime. Draco's belly laughs fell away as he recognized it, a small bit of a green-stitched D just visible on it. She looked up at him and their eyes met once more, her copper ones filled with unshed tears. How could you? She seemed to ask him. His own silver eyes carried a look of shock, of shame, of hurt. He knew he had no right to be hurt, but she was using the handkerchief he had given her to clean up the mess that Weasley had brought upon himself. The embarrassment that Weasley had intended for Draco. And yet, no amount of hurt he felt could probably compare to what she felt, he knew deep down. He dropped his gaze, ashamed. He had thought of that word as disgusting when his father used it, but given an opening to cut someone down, he had taken it. It made it far worse that the someone had been Hermione Granger. Oh. Draco's newfound apparent fixation on blood supremacy seemed to impress the upperclassmen of Slytherin House. Suddenly he was invited to sit in the choice chairs in the common room, to offer comment when Marcus or Adrian or Thaddeus were discussing politics or Quidditch. He seemed to have followers now, and not just Crabbe and Goyle. But for weeks, Draco obsessed that his fellow Slytherin teammates might more clearly recall those moments on the Quidditch pitch, not just the amusing incident of the Weasel vomiting up great big slimy slugs. but of Draco's reaction of slack-jawed shock at his own use of the word mudblood, and of the looks he had exchanged with Hermione before she left with the two twits. There was nothing for it, he needed to stop associating with her. He resolved once again to ignore her, to best her in class, to put this whatever friendship, acquaintanceship he'd had with her behind him. His side had been chosen for him the moment that the Sorting Hat had touched his blonde head, and she was a Gryffindor, a Muggle-born. Nothing about her was for him. Oh, Draco found ways to subtly put down Hermione when talking with other Slytherins, either in class or in the common room. He and the others would occasionally make fun of her swotness in class, pretending to raise their hands like her and point at her when the professors' backs were turned. He would agree and laugh with Pansy and the rest of the Slytherin girls about Hermione's bushy hair. He started to use the abhorrent term more often, noticing how his esteem among his Slytherin housemates increased the more he used it. Each time he said it, it rolled off his tongue more easily, but a part of him still felt a pang of regret at it, something he worked hard to ignore. It was becoming a bit easier each day, being a pure blood arse. At least that's what he told himself. Oh, did this witch even celebrate Halloween? It was the second year's second Halloween within Hogwarts, and once again Hermione was missing. This time, the Wonder Boy who wouldn't die and the Weasel were gone as well. Which was no surprise, the three of them were usually together nowadays, Draco had noticed with a bit miss than mild annoyance. The Halloween feast was excellent, as all Hogwarts feasts were. Many of the older students had already left for the common rooms, getting a head start on the late-night Halloween parties which were still to come. The younger students, mostly first and second years, being supervised by some of the prefects, were buzzing with excitement as the feast ended, crowding into the entrance hall. Half of them made their way upstairs to Gryffindor and Ravenclaw towers, the other half moving towards the cellars and dungeons. A great ruckus upstairs drew everyone's attention, and most of the Hufflepuffs and Slytherins turned back, hurrying up the stairs to investigate. A crowd was gathered on the second floor, and Draco could see some sort of red writing on a wall ahead. He pushed through the crowd, emerging in the clearing. The wall read, "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air beware. Enemies of the air beware. You'll be next mudbloods." Draco sneered, looking around. He realized suddenly that none of the older crowd of Slytherins that he was usually trying to impress with those words were here. Instead, he was surrounded by a lot of young and scared schoolmates from other houses. And Hermione. He flushed quite heavily in embarrassment, especially now that he saw a dead cat hanging near the words. The sight of it made his stomach roil, and suddenly the rich Halloween feast seemed like a bit of a mistake. Several professors, the caretaker Argus Filch and Professor Dumbledore bustled up, taking the cat down and making their way to Gilderoy Lockhart's classroom. Potter, Weasley, and Hermione were told to come as well, as they had apparently been the ones to find the cat and the words. Draco and the rest of the Slytherins, along with the crowd of Hufflepuffs, moved back down the staircase towards their common rooms. Everyone was talking and whispering furtively, some eyeing Draco, likely bothered by what he had said earlier in the corridor. The Slytherin common room party was in full swing, with the younger students sharing the gossip of what had happened with the older students. But Draco wasn't feeling up to it anymore. He went to lay down on his bed, drawing the curtains shut. What exactly was this Chamber of Secrets business? And who was the heir? Who were its enemies? It seemed unlikely that this was just a bit of Halloween fun. A cat had been killed for Salazar's sake. True, it was only Mrs. Norris whom nobody liked, but all the same, it seemed to be on the scope of a typical Halloween prank. Oh. After a couple of hours, Draco gave up going to sleep as a bad job and made his way out of the common room, stepping carefully around the litter of butterbeer and fire whiskey bottles, avoiding the snodding couples in the corners and on couches. He made his way to Professor Snape's office and knocked on the door. "Enter." Draco stepped in and closed the door behind him. "What can I do for you at this late hour, Mr. Malfoy? Tired of your after-party already?" Snape looked tired, but then again he always looked sunken-eyed and unshowered, so tonight was really not that much different. "I wanted to ask about what happened tonight." Draco settled himself in a chair opposite Snape's desk. "If you're worried about the cat, Mr. Malfoy, she will be fine." "She was not dead, only petrified," Snape smiled waspishly. "No, Professor. I just wanted to ask, who is this heir, and what is this Chamber of Secrets?" Snape sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. There is a legend that when Hogwarts was built, Salazar Slytherin, without the knowledge of the other 3 Hogwarts founders, built a secret chamber within the castle. The chamber was said to contain a creature that could be called upon to protect the castle's young inhabitants against enemies. If you will recall, Slytherin lived many years before the Statute of Secrecy. His enemies were Muggles naturally, and he felt that Muggle-borns, when challenged to decide between the magical world and the mundane one, would ally themselves with the Muggles. It is why he did not wish to teach Muggle-borns at Hogwarts. He was afraid that Muggles might come with torches and pitchforks and kill the young witches and wizards here at the school. So I was right, the Mudbloods are in danger. Draco asked quickly. Do not use that word. Snape sniped his words out at Draco, glaring at him. I'm sorry, Professor. Are the Muggle-borns in danger? Professor Snape eyed him curiously. For not the first time, Draco was nervous around his favorite professor. He consoled himself that at least Snape did not know that he was thinking specifically about Hermione Granger when he asked the question. I'm afraid I cannot say for certain. This creature, this beast, if it is indeed real, then it has been sealed away for centuries. I don't know who has opened it, but apparently it can only be opened by a descendant of Salazar Slytherin himself. Oh, this Gilderoy Lockhart fellow really was a foul, loathsome git. None of his defense against the dark arts classes had been especially useful to anyone. And now that Draco realized that some people within the school might actually need a real defense against dark forces, it seemed especially stupid that he was their sodding teacher. This knowledge was made far, far worse by the fact that nearly every witch in the entire school, including apparently Hermione, seemed to have a crush on him. Draco eyed the curly-haired arse critically as he stood in the front of the class, reading from yet another ridiculous passage from one of his moronic books. Today, as had happened for several classes before, Potter had joined him to act out various parts within the script. Draco's attention wandered, his eyes falling as they often did on Hermione. She was watching with rapt attention, sometimes mouthing the words along with Professor Lockhart as though she had memorized whole passages. Draco was unsurprised to realize that she probably had. He looked back up at the twiddling prat. What was so sodding great about him? His blonde hair, his eyes, his ridiculous teeth. How could one mouth hold all those teeth anyway? And blonde hair, well, that was just hair, Draco thought. His hair was much nicer looking than Lockhart's. True, Lockhart was grown and had muscles. So what? Draco would have muscles one day. What did all of these witches see in him? Draco narrowed his eyes at the bushy-haired girl near the front of the room. What did she see in him? Oh, Slytherin house members, like all the other Hogwarts houses, spoke of nothing in their free time except the Chamber of Secrets these days. Hoping to curry favor with those wondering who had opened it, Draco wrote to Lucius and Narcissa separately, asking if they knew anything about it. His mother answered negatively, saying that it sounded like some sort of silly fairy tale to her, and not to let it bother his mind. Lucius, however, sent a more cryptic answer, saying not to worry about it just yet and to stay out of the way of whoever it was that was doing it. He talked as though he knew something about it, and yet refused to tell Draco anything. This was no real surprise to Draco. There was power in knowledge, Lucius believed. His father was always certain to keep what he knew to himself. Oh, Draco's first Quidditch match as the new Slytherin Seeker would go down in popular Slytherin lore for many years to come. Unfortunately, it was for all of the wrong reasons. The rain didn't bother him. Growing up in Britain, rain was expected. If you waited for good weather to play Quidditch, you'd be waiting a while. And he felt well matched against Potter. His broom was of course superior, a direct improvement from last year's Nimbus 2000. And while the Scar head might be a natural flyer, Draco had years of practice and experience on his side. And yet, Potter had been acting weird all during the course of the match. Granted, there seemed to be something wrong with one of the bludgers, almost as though it were following Potter around the pitch. But Scarhead's antics and trying to avoid it were admittedly hilarious. At times, Draco would look over and he was hanging upside down, or zigzagging back and forth across the pitch. The Gryffindor captain called for a timeout. Draco gathered with the rest of the Slytherins, and Marcus Flint told him to keep his eyes open. Clearly, Potter was busy trying to keep away from that crazy bludger that seemed to have it out for him. So it should be quite easy to find the golden snitch while Potter was distracted. When play resumed, Potter's flying went from erratic to downright silly. At one point he seemed to do a funny little pirouette, spinning like a tornado in midair. Training for the ballet, Potter? Draco laughed. Potter looked at him with loathing. Just then, Draco spotted the bludger coming in fast on Potter's flank. His eyes widened, but before he could make even a bit of noise, the bludger had slammed with all its might into Potter. Honestly, it was a bit surprising that he hadn't been knocked off his broom. Draco heard a sickening crunching noise that he wasn't sure he wanted to identify. Then, like a madman, Potter was racing towards him. Draco swerved, thinking that the Gryffindor had gone mental. But it turned out that the snitch had been hovering right over him the entire time. The match was over, and Potter had somehow managed a miraculous catch with one broken arm, for fuck's sake. The Slytherins had lost, and it was entirely Draco's fault. Something which Marcus Flint had remarked about multiple times at the pitch, and in the days after, with increasingly loud volume. He took a lot of razzing and hate over the next few days at losing the match. He blamed Potter, bad-mouthing him to the other Slytherins. But privately, he knew that it was entirely his fault. The Gryffindors seemed determined to remind Slytherin House of their lead in the Quidditch Cup race and in house points, to rub their noses in it at every turn. One potions class, a firework was tossed into Greg Goyle's cauldron, resulting in swelling solutions spraying across the students, mainly the Slytherin students. As Draco made his way to Snape's desk for the antidote, his nose literally bigger than his own head, he saw that the majority of the Gryffindors were unaffected. Hermione looked especially smug about the entire thing. Draco almost suspected her of tossing the firework, but had no proof. An image of the potions professor's robes being set on fire sprang to mind. If she had not been the one to toss the firework, she certainly knew who had, judging by the look on her face. He thought once again that this muggle-born witch could have easily been sorted into Slytherin House. Oh. When the announcements to sign up for Dueling Club were posted, Draco was rather excited. He had never dueled for real, and though he had challenged Potter to a duel last year, he knew his skills were rough at best. This would be a change to learn from professionals. Rumor had been going around that Flitwick had won several dueling competitions, so Draco assumed he'd be teaching it. Therefore, it was particularly disappointing to find Professor Git Lockhart there to teach the lesson instead. The students were paired off, and somehow, in a rare bit of poetic justice, he supposed he and Potter were to square off against each other. Potter's tickling jinx had brought him to his knees, and he barely had the voice to force out his own jinx. Tarantalega. Draco looked up through the tears of laughter streaming from his eyes to see Potter dancing like a maniac. If possible, he laughed even harder. The rest of the duels had gone no better. Most of the students were lying on the ground, with the notable exception of Hermione with Millie, in which the latter had the bushy-haired witch in a headlock. Draco watched in amazement once Snape had lifted the tickling jinx. Millie was easily twice the size of Hermione, and yet Hermione continued to fight back fiercely. Snape and Lockhart selected Draco and Potter for a demonstration duel, and Draco privately thought that this was a bad idea. They bowed to each other slightly and stepped several paces apart. Snape whispered something in his ear, and without thinking, Draco repeated the incantation. Serpensortia. A giant black snake sprang from the tip of his wand, landing heavily on the floor and hissing angrily. Draco, along with everyone else in the hall, stepped back quickly. Despite being a member of Slytherin House, Draco was no fan of snakes. Well, almost everyone else stepped back. Lockhart tried to vanish the snake, but only succeeded in riling it up more, throwing it into the air and banging it back onto the ground. Now the snake appeared to find a target, Justin Finch-Fletchley, who sat at the edge of the crowd. And to everyone's surprise, Potter began moving forward. He hissed and spat at the snake, which miraculously seemed to understand him. The snake coiled, head up and alert, but did not move towards Justin again. Draco stood slack-jawed, all pretense of a duel forgotten. Potter was a Parselmouth. That night, alone in his drape-drawn bed, Draco turned the incident over and over again in his mind. A Parselmouth. Someone who could speak to and understand snakes. The House of Slytherin's symbol was a snake. Could Harry Potter, the chosen one, actually be the heir of Slytherin? And Hermione had chosen him as her friend. She was possibly in greater danger than Draco had realized. It took him hours to fall into a fitful sleep, and his dreams were filled with snakes and dead cats with copper-colored eyes. Oh,